My name is Zahniser, and I'm here to give you a little background on the Erie County Underwater Recovery Team. Upon being discharged from the U.S. Navy in the early 50s, I returned to Sandusky and was involved in forming the first scuba diving club in Sandusky, Ohio, namely the Sandusky Underwater Explorers. During that time, I met Sergeant Denver Hauser, and he also became a member of our club. That was in 1957. Mr. Hauser was a police officer with the Huron Police Department, and he and I always had an idea that there was a need for an underwater recovery team in this area because of our water exposure between the lakes and the rivers and the creeks and the quarries and the boating, etc. So Mr. Hauser and I decided to form this two-man dive team. And in the summer of 1957, while he was on duty, and he always carried his diving equipment in the trunk of the cruiser, they had a tragedy at Old Woman's Creek, which was east of Huron, Ohio. Denver got on the phone and advised me that there was a tragedy at the Old Woman's Creek, and I responded, and both of us met the young couple there, and their 11-month-old baby was in a baby buggy along the creek, and it started to roll because of the brake malfunction or whatever, and the 11-month-old child went into the river, and Denver and I were instrumental in recovering that drowned child. And that was the beginning of a long, long story. After a few recoveries made under water disaster circumstances, the islands got our name, namely Put-in Bay, Ohio, and Kelly's Island, and they also called us when there was a water tragedy. So it was non-stop for a period of many, many years, until the unfortunate, untimely death of Sergeant Hauser, which passed away in December '74 from lung cancer. During that era that we worked together from 1957 to '74, we kept a in-depth diary, took photographs of most of the tragedies we went to. We made in excess of 150 recoveries of drowned victims. There were no trained divers doing underwater recovery work until 1957. Prior to that, when there was a water disaster and or a drowning, the local fire departments would respond, get a shallow water vessel, and drop drag hooks on the bottom and drag. That got to be it was an old-time theory before divers got into the picture, but it was now a very nice ways to drag large 4-prong hooks and picked up bodies that were drowned. It was a very unsophisticated way of doing it. Probably in the years that we did this kind of work, our most hazardous thing was recovering people that, such as ice boaters, ice fishermen, just people in general that went out on Lake Erie in the wintertime, not realizing how dangerous it can be. But for a period of 30 years, our dive team made most of the recoveries through the ice. And that's probably one of our most dangerous operations is ice diving. You need a qualified diver down and a backup diver, and it creates a few more problems than normal. We were called out of state on many instances where they had a major tragedy. In 1958, in the Big Sandy River next to Prestonburg, Kentucky, a school bus returning from school slid off of a 2-lane icy road down a 50-foot embankment and then went into the Big Sandy River. Inside the bus were 28 children, and at that point the river was quite deep, little or no visibility, 3 or 4 knots of current, and unfortunately there were 28 kids in the school bus. We were instrumental in helping recover the school bus in that particular tragedy. In the mid-60s, Foster Chevrolet in Sandusky, Ohio, donated a van to us which we lettered, and that made our recovery van and carried all of our equipment to all the tragedy sites. In the August of '67, there were a group of skydivers that were flying overhead and supposedly were to be dropped over Wakeman, Ohio at the airport there. The pilot of this World War II B-29, which had 17 skydivers aboard, called the air control tower, and the air control tower looked on his radar blip and said, "You're right on target." However, the blip that he saw was another airplane, and the airplane, the jump airplane, was 14 miles northwest of where he should have been. The air control tower told the pilot, "You're right on target," and the pilot told the jump master, "Everything's okay," and 17 jumpers dived out of the aircraft at approximately 10,000 feet. It was an overcast day. They come through the cloud cover at about 3,000 feet when they realized they were being dropped over Lake Erie. That was a major, major tragedy. 2 of the jumpers were picked up by passing boaters coming into Huron River, but unfortunately the other 15 that jumped drowned in Lake Erie. The jumpers had full jumpsuits on and no flotation devices. They were about 2.5 miles offshore with little or no visibility that day and a south wind, and therefore they all drowned. We worked with many people, volunteers, the Bureau of the Wildlife Division, U.S. Coast Guard, and we went out every day for a 3-hour period for 7 days, and eventually we picked up the remaining 15 jumpers that drowned. A few years later, we went to Logan County, West Virginia, and there's a little town in the southwest part of West Virginia called Buffalo Creek. And this is a town of approximately 500 or 600 people, just a small area, maybe a few more. At the foot of this small town was a man-made lake. It had been there for many years, and one side of the lake was held back by a coal slag dam, which is the leftover slag from coal mines. The lake was approximately 30 feet deep and a couple miles long, and one tragic day, over the period of years, the people in the area had no idea the coal slag dam was being undermined by the water, and the entire coal slag dam broke. It set a wall of water approximately 30 feet high and over 1,000 feet wide, and it swept down through the entire town like a tsunami, and it destroyed over 500 homes and killed 75 people. And we were instrumental. We arrived shortly after that happened, and we helped locate a great deal of the drowned victims in basements, under rivers, under bridges, in cars, whatever. That was one of our main jobs in helping recover those people which perished in that major disaster. Shortly after Denver Hauser's death, I was devastated to the point where I thought I would then retire from that type of work and forget it, but I just couldn't do it. So for about 3 years I went on by myself trying to respond and do the type of recovery work that we used to do, but it didn't work very well because I didn't have an experienced partner. In 1977, I met a gentleman that was attached to the Erie County Sheriff's Department, and it was Deputy Sheriff Joseph McPeak. Joe was a seasoned diver at that point. He and I got together and we formed a underwater recovery team within the Erie County Sheriff's Department, and we became an arm of the Sheriff's Department. During that time, we trained 5 additional deputy sheriffs, and we continued on as a dive team and an arm of the Sheriff's Department until 1992. At that point in time, I retired from the underwater recovery team, and I let Sergeant McPeak take over as dive master, and he continued on for quite a few years thereafter. End of story.